Christmas city. And one October morning, Christmas came early for someone in town. A bank employee arriving for work found the front door unlocked and the vault wide open.
A bank robbery in Knoll was just the last thing that people would be thinking about. It's nothing like you would see in a large city.
Bank officials discovered more than $71,000 was missing. The robbers also managed to haul away over $4,000 in wrapped coins. On the floor of the bank, police found 2 spent .45 caliber shell casings left when the robber shot the lens of the security camera. The area was dusted for fingerprints, but none were found.
It was pretty obvious that the perpetrators had been careful, either wearing gloves or just very careful not to leave or touch any portion of the bank that would leave a good fingerprint.
Only 3 employees could open the vault. One was Dan Short, the bank president.
He was the one that had the access to both the bank front door and the vault. It'd just be an obvious conclusion in some people's minds that he might have had something to do with it.
51-year-old Dan Short was well liked and respected, but he had recently experienced some personal problems.
Dan Short's wife had left some 16 months prior to the time of the crime. He did seem to be restless and uneasy, unsatisfied with the way his life was going at that time. Perhaps drinking too much.
Investigators couldn't locate Dan Short, and his pickup truck was missing from his home.
There was an area where it looked like that the contents of his pickup had just been swept out onto the ground.
It appeared he had left in a hurry. A wastebasket was overturned, dresser drawers were left open, and Dan's glasses were still on the bureau.
That would appear that there had been a struggle because he never went anywhere without his glasses.
And there was another sign that Short may not have been a willing participant. As president, Dan Short was aware of a hidden compartment in the bank vault that held an additional $100,000, but it hadn't been touched. Police and volunteers searched the area for clues.
We checked every ravine, every canyon, all the woods and buildings and everything around there.
A few hours later, police found Dan Short's truck 2 miles outside of town. Loose coins were scattered around it.
We now have to wonder, well, how did he get somewhere else? There has to be a second vehicle. There has to be some other people who have removed him from there.
Investigators had no money, no witnesses, no forensic evidence, and no sign of Dan Short, meaning the perpetrators were either smart or lucky. It didn't take long for news of the bank robbery to spread, since Knoll only had about 1,000 residents.
Everybody was shocked. It's all you could hear talked about at the cafes. People were bunched up in little groups along the street talking about it.
5 days after the robbery, a fisherman on Grand Lake, 21 miles outside of town, saw a body floating in the water. It was Dan Short, the bank president. He had been tied to a chair with duct tape. A cement block and a chain hoist had been attached to weigh it down, but it wasn't enough to overcome the buoyancy caused by the body gases.
We now have the ultimate of crimes. We have the taking of a human life. Mr. Short would have gladly given all of the money in the bank and traded it for his life. But these individuals were not content with that.
The medical examiner found water in Short's lungs, meaning he was alive when thrown into the lake.
The general consensus was that the people who committed this crime were just really, really cruel, ugly, bad people.
The tape used to bind Short to the chair was sent to the FBI for analysis. Robert Webb used heat to carefully separate each piece. Next, all of the pieces were tested to see if they came from the same roll.
The infrared spectrophotometer tells the chemical composition of the sticky glue in the duct tape, the fibers, and the plastic backing. It tells me what kind of material it's made up of.
Tests revealed every piece of tape was the same brand. The next step was like a puzzle, as Webb tried to piece together the entire 60-yard roll using what is known as end match analysis.
The pieces of duct tape were torn off the roll in all kinds of different lengths, from very short, 6-7 inches long, to 2 and 3 feet long, or more. Starting from the very first piece of tape that was torn off the roll, I was able to tell the first piece of tape came from the left wrist, the second piece of tape came from the right wrist, third piece came from the mouth, then longer pieces of tape were torn off and wrapped around his chest, around his forearms, around his legs and thighs. I was able to read the whole piece of tape and tell where every piece was applied and in what order, so that he had no chance of getting away.
But there was one piece missing.
One piece of duct tape separated from all these other pieces when it was in the lake and floated away.
Investigators wondered where this piece of tape got to and why it was missing from the chair. Someone reported seeing a brown van parked on the bridge over Grand Lake on the night of the bank robbery. Another caller overheard two brothers, Joe and Shannon Nagofsky, talking about money.
From what I've heard of Shannon Nagofsky, his bragging about being the richest teenager in the county or something like that.
In fact, they owned 45 caliber firearms. They allowed the FBI agents to test fire those guns, and the casings were matched with the casings in the bank and were found not to be the guns.
The Agofsky's family members said the boys were at home on the night of the robbery.
They were eliminated after being interviewed and seemed cooperative and had plausible alibis.
Police also learned that two convicted felons, Billy Ray Hankins and Larry Wayne Hankins, were living in Knoll at the time, but they both had solid alibis.
They had robbed several banks and hadn't never abducted anyone in the process, but robbed banks and all kind of stuff. But their mother testified for him as an alibi.
Police also questioned Dan Short's estranged wife, Joyce.
Anytime you have an estranged family like this and one of the individuals ends up missing or harmed, you know, one of the people you have to look at is his wife.
Joyce said she knew nothing about the crime and willingly agreed to take a polygraph test. She passed. Two different television programs profiled the case, asking viewers with information to contact police. Gerald Elkins played the role of Dan Short in the televised recreations.
They actually held me over the bridge. And every time they started holding me over, I'd grab the railing. And they said, "Gerald, you have to let go of the railing, and we want you to act scared." And I said, "Well, that won't be any problem," because I was scared.
The programs generated hundreds of tips, but none proved helpful. Investigators needed forensic evidence because without it, the trail of the killers was turning cold fast. With so little crime in Knoll, Missouri, the discovery of Dan Short's body in Grand Lake took almost everyone in town by surprise.
My little boy came home from school one day and said, "Dad, they got the bridge blocked off. There's cops everywhere." And so I look outside, and sure enough, they had the bridge blocked off, investigating. And I stood out on the deck of my porch and watched all the activities.
When police left the area, Rowdy Foreman did a little investigating of his own.
Curiosity got the best of me. We went back down to the shoreline, walked from east to west on the bank. We come to this one single dock, fishing dock, and there was a strand of duct tape which appeared to be turned halfway inside out.
Was this the missing piece of duct tape investigators were looking for? Foreman knew not to touch the tape with his fingers, so he placed it into a bag with a stick.
When Mr. Foreman walked into my office that day with that piece of tape, it was too good to be true.
First words that came out of his mouth, "Oh my God."
There were 2, if not 3, patent fingerprints in this greasy, rusty residue.
Gentleman, he said, "Jesus, Jesus, I can't believe it."
Investigators analyzed the tape to see if it was the one missing piece.
I was conclusively able to match that piece of duct tape by end matching to the reconstructed roll of duct tape associated with the chair and the chain and the cinder block.
This was crucial, because without proof the tape was from the same roll, the fingerprints meant nothing. FBI fingerprint examiner Russell Davey could tell how the prints were left on the tape.
By grabbing the tape and pulling away from the roll, as can be seen by tearing it away, and then there would be prints present on the end of the tape.
The fingerprints were compared to those in the FBI database of past criminal offenders, and there was no match. Several months later, there were rumors that 2 brothers, 18-year-old Shannon Agofsky and his 23-year-old brother Joe, were spending large amounts of money despite the fact that they were unemployed. Both had been suspects early on in the investigation but had been cleared.
Joseph Agofsky paid for a trip to Disneyland for his honeymoon. He paid for a wedding ring. He paid to have a chainsaw souped up.
Something in the neighborhood of $45,000 by both brothers after the months, during the months following their robbery and murder.
And a witness identified the chain hoist found with Dan Short's body as the one he left at the Agofskys' home.
So the chain hoist led us back to the Agofskys. At that point, we focused on the 2 brothers, believing that they at least had knowledge of who the perpetrators were, or they were in fact involved themselves. At that point, we didn't know which might be the case.
Man, similar to the one a witness saw on the Grand Lake Bridge on the night of the murder. And another man told police that he saw the Agofskys wiping their bullets clean before loading them into their guns. This occurred several days before the robbery.
And their explanation for doing so was that if they ever got caught doing whatever they were going to do with the firearms and the ammunition, they wouldn't find fingerprints of theirs.
Was it possible that a pair of robbers, careful enough to remove their fingerprints from bullet casings, were careless enough to leave them on a piece of tape? The prime suspects in the bank robbery and murder of Dan Short were 2 brothers, Joe and Shannon Agofsky. There was no forensic evidence found at the bank, but investigators found 2 fingerprints on a piece of duct tape recovered at the lake where Short was murdered. When asked, Joe Agofsky willingly agreed to provide his fingerprints. His brother refused.
I had difficulty in obtaining those of Shannon. I talked to him several times, and for one reason or the other, he couldn't provide them or would not provide them at that time.
When Joseph Agofsky's prints were received for comparison, I compared the latent prints on the tape from the shoreline with his. And they were very, very close, but they were not identical. I said if this Joseph Agofsky had a brother, it would be interesting to see his prints because they're so close.
With this information, the FBI requested and received a court order for Shannon's fingerprints.
There was more than adequate number of ridge characteristics for me to come to the conclusion that these prints from the tape were indeed left by the index and middle fingers of Shannon Agofsky.
A suspect put his mark on one piece of duct tape, and that one piece of duct tape was positively associated with an entire roll of duct tape that had been applied to a deceased person. So the suspect could not deny he was involved in the case.
Prosecutors believe the Agofskys waited until Dan Short's dinner guests left that evening, then abducted him. At the bank, Short opened the vault but didn't tell them about the secret compartment which held an additional $100,000.
Come on!
Afterwards, the brothers abandoned Dan's truck, then tied him to a chair they had prepared beforehand with the cinder block and chains already attached. The evidence shows the brothers used all 60 yards of duct tape, and Shannon inadvertently left his fingerprints on the piece of tape used to secure Dan's ankles to the chair. At Grand Lake, the brothers threw Dan Short over the side of the bridge. When they threw Short into the lake, one of the chair's spindles broke, releasing the piece of duct tape from his ankle. The lake's current carried this single piece of tape with Shannon Agofsky's fingerprints to the shore on the opposite side of the lake, where it was discovered 5 days later by a citizen volunteer.
The evidence, the duct tape, the fingerprints on the duct tape. Sometimes I just wonder what would have happened if nobody found it.
It would be kind of surprising in a way that something had been underwater would have prints on it that long.
Knowing that Dan Short was alive before he was thrown over, and the callousness of the Agofsky brothers in sending this man to his death in that manner has to stand out as the thing that I remember to this day.
3 years after the crime, Joe and Shannon Agofsky were tried and convicted of the bank robbery charges. Both were sentenced to life in prison. The brothers' next court date was for Dan Short's murder. By all accounts, the jury was mesmerized by the amount of information Robert Webb gleaned from the pieces of duct tape.
Had an opportunity to take the reconstructed roll of duct tape, string it all out in front of the judge and the jury, and walk down the whole roll of tape and tell the jury and show the jury the first piece that was ripped off went on an arm, and so forth, and tell the story all the way down the whole length of tape.
Shannon Agofsky was convicted of Dan Short's murder and was sentenced to an additional life term in prison. Joe Agofsky's case ended in a mistrial. Prosecutors chose not to retry him since he was already serving a life sentence for the robbery.
Without the forensic evidence in this case, we would probably have not identified the Agofskys, much less prove the case against them.
The fact they used duct tape may in fact have been one of the things they did they wish they had not done.
It tells me the sequence of events at the scene, even though I wasn't there, the evidence was.